Just going to wait a second while we have our attendees pop in. All right, well, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Audrey Stewart. I'm going to be your moderator for today's webinar. Thank you so much to IGFOA for this opportunity to connect with our partners in Illinois in this time when, we can't necessarily connect in person. So we're really excited to share this valuable information about disaster relief funding and revenue recovery tools for local governments. Thank you, IGFOA members, for joining us today, and welcome and thank you for joining for the rest of the country nationwide. Although this webinar includes many Illinois specifics, this information is highly relevant and applicable to all communities in the United States, big and small. And to those of you in local government, thank you for your service. You have been on the front line of this crisis. We are going to provide you with some follow-up resources. So the links to those resources that we covered today, I will provide you in an email, and along with the latest Localgov and Azavar articles. And we've been covering all the disaster relief funding updates. You're also going to receive a recording of this webinar and a PDF of the slide decks. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to have about a 15-minute Q&A session, and we're going to try our hardest to schedule to answer all of those questions. And if we don't get to your question, you'll have an opportunity to actually schedule a personal consultation about your financial maximization potential. So we're really excited. We have a bunch of great information for you today, and we will dive right in, and I will introduce our panelists. So we have Aaron Thompson, our Localgov contributor from Greenup, Kentucky. Hi, Aaron.
Hey, everybody. Pleasure to be with you guys from the neighboring state of Kentucky. As Audrey mentioned, I'm a contributor for both Azavar and Localgov. Localgov, I write several of the different blog posts that have been on the blog, and look forward to talking with you more today about some of these funding resources. A little bit about my background. I previously worked for a member of Congress, and my job responsibilities, part of that was to work directly with local governments within our congressional district, and then following that experience, I worked with the state executive branch in Kentucky in the Department for Local Government, where I worked and did outreach on behalf of the governor's office and Department of Local Government across the northern and eastern part of the state. So it's a pleasure to be with you guys, and I look forward to talking with you more later about some of the resources that are available. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. And we have Steve Price, our FEMA disaster funding expert in New Orleans, Louisiana. Hi, Steve.
Hey, Audrey. How's everybody doing? Thank you all for being here. It's really great to be here with everybody and have this opportunity to talk to you guys about the potential reimbursement programs that are out there for you during this unprecedented times of what we're doing. My background is local government for about 30 years of my career, and then about 15 years got into the private sector. And since then, I've been dealing with FEMA disaster recovery for local governments. So I have a master's in public administration, so most of my life has been governmental background. And I do look forward to giving you some ideas on how we may be able to help you guys get the best refunds you're able to get through FEMA. Thank you, and look forward to talking to you.
Thank you, Steve. And we have Tom Fagan, our senior analyst and sales manager at Azavar in Chicago. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Audrey. Thanks so much for having me. To a lot of the Illinois contingent, a lot of you I know, so thank you for being on, and I look forward to seeing you in the flesh again very, very soon. To the new Illinois contingent that I haven't met, welcome to the webinar. I look forward to discussing some ideas for you to maximize your revenue, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar. I think there's a lot of interesting information that's going to come your way, and I'll be back in just a little while to talk with you.
All right, and I do have one question from Grants, and he says, I cannot hear the speaker, so I just want to make sure that everybody can hear us and the audio is okay. There is a chat box that you can interact with us, and Jill's saying she can hear, so I hope that, Grants, you can hear us. And please feel free to leave your question throughout the entire webinar, and we will be looking through those and then answer them at the end. And you can also, utilize this chat box if you just want to say hi, tell us where you're from, where you're watching from today, and we will dive right in. Aaron?
Thank you very much, Audrey. Appreciate it. So today we're going to be going through 4 different resources or areas where resources have become available from the federal government, working to help state and local governments across the country. And just like you're going through as a local government facing some of these circumstances, a lot of them are kind of very unique as far as the problems that have came up and the solutions to be able to address them. And so there's a lot of different programs that the federal government has instituted to help make sure that you as a local government can respond, and that other agencies, whether they be within the state or even some folks within the private sector, that they have the tools to be able to respond. We'll be talking about some of the initial federal action that occurred, the CARES Act, what all was included in that, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and then for this last section on FEMA public assistance, we'll turn it over to Steve to talk about that. So moving on, right after we kind of understood what was going to happen with coronavirus and the impact that it was going to have on our country, there were 2 initial things that happened before the major piece of legislation through the CARES Act. The first one that you should be aware of, just as an employer, is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And that's important because it required sick leave or FMLA for employees related to the coronavirus. So as an employer, this is something that you're responsible to make sure that if there's employees in these situations, that they have the ability to take care of themselves and ultimately not contaminate others, including your own workforce. Now, it's important to know that tax credits are available for this for the private sector to help pay for the leave, but there is no assistance was directly allocated to be able to help for local governments. But from a compliance perspective, that's important for you to know. Secondly, under the initial steps was the Municipal Liquidity Facility Fund. And so this fund was set up through the Federal Reserve. There's $500 billion that has been set aside for this. And basically, it's to help both state and local governments basically meet their revenue needs and their shortfall needs that they have in the form of actually borrowing money. So this assists through short-term debt through either tax revenue or bond anticipation notes or other general short-term notes. But again, this is all funds that have to be paid back, but especially for being able to try to find funds to be able to borrow, the key point here was trying to make sure that there was money available in the market to meet these needs. Now, the way that the program works is only communities of certain sizes are able to directly be able to receive these or be able to directly work with the federal government to borrow these funds. So for Illinois specifically, the only city that would be eligible to participate was Chicago, and then there are only 5 counties, and those include, as mentioned on the screen, Cook, DuPage, Lake, Will, and Kane counties. So for either the city or the 5 counties that were mentioned, or also the state of Illinois, the way that it works is all the political subdivisions, whether you're a city, maybe a school district, any of those different political subdivisions that fall underneath of there, they can access these funds through that higher agency. So for the counties or the city that we mentioned, they can work with those folks to be able to borrow that from there. And then at the state level, smaller local governments theoretically could do that from the state of Illinois. And, it's important to just do the research on that specifically and learn what options are available. But we did want to mention that program to you. Moving on, the CARES Act is probably the biggest piece of legislation that you heard. Audrey, if you wouldn't mind to move back one slide, sorry about that. The CARES Act is probably a bill that you heard about over the past several months, and it's nearly a $2 trillion bill that had a lot of different spending in it to try to make sure that everyone had the resources that they needed to be able to respond to the crisis. Several of the programs that you see on the screen right now are ones that you're probably familiar with and have utilized as a local government before. And basically what the CARES Act did was it allocated additional monies on top of the funds that are already there. And we'll go through these 5 here in particular that are important for you as a local government. The Economic Development Administration Fund has information is there to be able to help with your economic planning for your community. It's under the Department of Commerce, and it's very much focused on regional economic development planning and undertaking other initiatives to just spur economic development in your area. It's a very flexible program in that area, but there's more money that's been set aside to make sure that you can plan ahead. And we'll send some information out about this program for how you can apply along with the rest of the others. The Community Block Development Grant Program is probably a program that you really most likely have used. It's one of the most utilized federal programs for local governments. It can help with everything from sidewalks to sewer and sanitation projects to community centers. And the way that these funds are normally distributed, if you're one of the larger communities, you probably receive these funds automatically through an entitlement. If you're a smaller community, you'll receive these funds through a state-based agency. In the state of Illinois, it's the Illinois Department of Commerce. So the entitlement cities will have or are in the process of already receiving these funds automatically, and they'll have the discretion to be able to on how to spend those. And then for the smaller communities, you're going to be able to apply directly to the, in the case of Illinois, the Department of Commerce to be able to access these funds. The Emergency Solutions Grant is a program that is distributed very much in the same manner as CDBG. It's very focused on meeting the housing needs of those in your community, particularly the homeless. And so there was $4 billion allocated across the country through the program. For the larger cities, they receive entitlement dollars automatically. And then for the smaller ones, they apply for that. So in Illinois, it's the Illinois Department of Human Services that actually will be allocating out these funds. The Burn Justice Assistance Grant Program is the 4th one we wanted to highlight today. It's also sometimes referred to as JAG, and that helps with a lot of your different law enforcement costs, kind of ranging across the board and can be utilized for different things. There was an additional $850 million that was being spent across the country within this pot of money. For very much like the other programs that we mentioned, those larger communities, they've already been receiving these funds directly from the Federal Department of Justice. And then within smaller communities, within the state of Illinois, it's the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority that actually distributes out these funds. So for all 4 of these, in particular, the CDBG Emergency Solutions and the JAG Grant Program, you've probably utilized these as a local government before, and those will go through the normal channels that you've accessed these funds in the past. But again, we'll be sending out additional information following the webinar on how to receive these. The 5th program is the Paycheck Protection Program, and there was about $659 billion allocated over the course of 2 different bills, and this is the program that became available to help with resources as far as meeting payroll, making other critical payments that were needed, and making sure that businesses stayed afloat. These are forgivable loans, and they apply for these loans through a SBA lender. But additionally, any FDIC institution can actually apply and be able to help to distribute these funds. There still is money remaining in this program, so businesses that are in your community that need support, would encourage you to take a look at this program and share this information with them. Moving on to the Coronavirus Relief Fund. This is kind of the area most focused on local governments and being able to help. And through all the different programs that I've talked about up to this point, or what Steve will talk about later, it's really critical to remember that there's a lot of different pots of funds that you can access as a local government. And it's important that you figure out where your needs are at exactly, and from what resources you'll be able to apply for or try to pull funds through or from rather. So just really be thinking about that throughout this. The Coronavirus Relief Fund was a part of the CARES Act totaling $150 billion. And it is there specifically to help to provide these resources to help you as a local government have the funds that you need. The expenses address medical or public health needs, but then they also go on a little bit further from, say your medical or public health needs that you have. What are the ramifications of that? And what are some of the downfalls or pitfalls, and how do we address them? And so that's some of the different areas that this specific fund addresses. And we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. A few specific examples here include medical expenses. So that can include medical facilities for responses, for just a response overall, or for testing facilities. For public health expenses, this includes communicating or enforcing a public health order. For payroll expenses, if you've had staff that has had to work additional time to be able to respond specifically to the coronavirus response in your community, that is something that is eligible. Expenses of actions to facilitate compliance with COVID-19 related public health measures. So basically that means if hey, the school district in your community has had to shut down because of the virus and they're doing instruction from home, if there was some technology that they needed to purchase to be able to secure online instructions for students, that's something that potentially could be utilized through this program. Additionally, let's say you had a high-risk individual, perhaps somebody that was elderly, that couldn't leave home and they needed food, say Meals on Wheels program, for example. That's another program that potentially you could take a look at and making sure that it meets the appropriate criteria here in utilizing it. The next category mentioned here is the expenses related with the provision of economic support in connection with the public health emergency. So in particular, if you have local businesses in your community and you're looking for some way to support them, following the crisis, or you try to do that during the crisis, that's something that this would allow for some type of small business or other business support program. And lastly, there's just kind of another big criteria under miscellaneous for anything else that is focused on responding to the medical or public health need or any of the other secondary effects. And we'll talk about how you actually access these funds in just a second. But first, the stipulations. And it's really critical here to remember that these funds cannot be utilized to fill shortfalls within your government revenue. But as I mentioned before, look at the different resources that are available, apply for those. And there's a lot of funds that are out here, and see where they can help with some of the costs that you have incurred or you're going to incur as a result of the virus and the economic impact. And for the COVID or for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, it's important to remember that these funds can only be reimbursed for expenses that were incurred between March the 1st of this year and December 30th of this year. So you've got a 10-month period for expenditures this year that are only eligible to be reimbursed. Now, the other programs I mentioned, like CDBG or Emergency Solutions Grants, they don't apply under this category. This is just the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And moving on to some of the other ineligible expenses, they're pretty self-explanatory, but damages covered by insurance, payroll or benefit expenses not related to responding to the crisis, expenses that have been or reimbursed under another federal program, reimbursements to donors for donated items or service, workforce bonuses other than hazard pay or overtime, severance pay, or legal settlements. So again, for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, it's very critical to remember only things directly related to the virus and your community's response. And then lastly, kind of the most important question on this particular fund is how can you access these funds? So we'll move on to the next slide here. Like several of the other programs that we talked about before, your larger communities will receive these funds automatically, and smaller ones will have to work through a state-based agency to be able to receive it. Within the state of Illinois, the only communities that were able to receive these funds directly were actually the same ones I mentioned for the Municipal Liquidity Fund. and that included the city of Chicago, and then the counties included Cook, DuPage, Kane, Lake, and Will counties. So they received their allocation from the Coronavirus Relief Fund automatically. And for the counties in particular, and then with the city of Chicago, they have the discretion to be able to allocate those funds and spend those funds within their community, especially for the cities where they're not going to receive funds. That's something that it's important to coordinate with the county and get everybody on the same page. But the state of Illinois did receive funds, and over the coming weeks, more information will be released specifically about how those funds will be given to local governments. It's through the Local Cure Fund, and there's a minimum of $250 million that will be allocated out through that. There had to be a law change to make sure that these funds were actually able to be distributed down as they are, and that new law will come into effect on July 1st. So just make sure that you continue to look for more information about that and how to be able to access these funds. And basically, a lot of other states right now, to give you a little bit more perspective, they're pretty much on the same timetable. They're taking a look at how to access or how to distribute these funds within the state and working through that process right now. So be on the lookout for that. Moving on, just a couple things of closing on my part. Make sure that you are identifying funding opportunities that we mentioned here and where they can be supported at, as far as different needs that you're having in each community, and which money applies to which best pot to be able to meet your needs. And then, lastly, I just want to mention, make sure that, especially with my background, having worked for a member of Congress and an executive branch of state government before, make sure that you're communicating with those folks, whether they be field staff for your congressional office or your state legislators. Make sure that they kind of know what's going on and what you are facing in your community. So whenever they're making decisions at the state capitol or in Washington, they know truly what you're facing and how they can best help be able to respond. And for the next part of our presentation, we'll turn it over to Steve. He's going to be talking about FEMA Public Assistance, a program you guys have probably utilized quite a bit in the past. So Steve, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate it. And once again, thanks everybody for being here. And we enjoy the opportunity to let you know some of the things that are available out there for your local governments. So moving into the FEMA disaster recovery process, most of you have probably dealt with FEMA before, and a lot of you have not. We're finding it out throughout the country. That depends on which area you are, who's dealt with them previously. But as you can see, you are all eligible for potential FEMA reimbursement. Applicants of state, territorial, tribal, local governments, and certain private nonprofits. This also includes schools and other agencies that are under governmental control. Currently, we're under the emergency exigent time period, which means that you are able to use your emergency procurement process, whatever that may be, for securing items that are related to the emergency. That could be anything from PPE type equipment or services that you may need for the emergency. FEMA right now is covering and reimbursing Category B emergency response expenses. What that means is you are eligible to get anything that you're spending towards the emergency reimbursed. Currently, the emergency period is now extended, as you see on the slide, through the end of the current year, the end of 2020. What that means to you and where it becomes important to you is that you may have spent money previously dealing with the emergency, but the good thing is anything you spend moving forward all the way through the end of the year is a potential reimbursable item by FEMA. The current disaster declaration is reimbursing 75% of expenses that are eligible. That meaning if you spend $100, you get $75 back from FEMA as you go through the reimbursement process. And the important thing about FEMA is that FEMA is a policy-driven program. It is funded through Congress but it is a budgeted program that every year is funded for disaster recovery. So in essence, you as an applicant are eligible and deserve to be reimbursed for certain items that are in the FEMA Stafford Act and CFR 44. There's been a lot of publications that have come out responsible for the COVID-19 disaster. And it's similar to other disasters that you may have dealt with, but it has some different nuances in there. And some of those will be on the, as we move along to the next page. Some of the things that are eligible items from FEMA are your overtime that you may have used for emergency type operations, for operations related to any disaster recovery process that you may have. You may have done something in public works. You may have done something with your police department, your fire department, your first responders. You may have had people come in and work because you wanted your emergency operations to be running in your water and sewer department and stuff like that, where other people were shut in and they had to stay at home. So some of these items are going to be eligible reimbursable. The overtime is definitely eligible during this time period for items that are specifically worked on the COVID-19 emergency response. The other things that can be eligible, that will be eligible, are items that you purchase that are not ordinary expenses related to your ordinary operations. Some of the things, as you see on here, a hand sanitizer, mask. You heard Aaron mention earlier, if you had an area that you had to buy some computers or softwares or thing like that, that to keep the social distancing process moving so the public wouldn't have to come into your office to do business, those items may be eligible also for reimbursement. The PPE type equipment that you may have purchased for your police, fire, your everyday workers, that may be eligible also. Some of these things are very direct eligible items that when you read what FEMA has put out for their response as a category B, very simple. And the items we mentioned are simple. The ones that become a little more complicated are things that you are buying that may have to become permanent repairs or replacements in a facility. So if you put up temporary type plexiglass so people can have some distancing, those things should be eligible reimbursements. If you build a brand new building, that may not be. And that's, I know I'm going from one extreme to the other, but that's kind of how we deal with FEMA. The support staff that you may, if you decide that you want to have an outside contractor come in and help you with the grants management of your reimbursement process, that is also reimbursable at the same 75%. And it has been for a long time. An example is I've been working, as I mentioned earlier, in disaster recovery for the past 15 years. And the major disaster that I worked is Hurricane Katrina. And we are still currently working on that particular event because we started at the beginning of damage assessments. We helped people write project worksheets. We are now in the construction process has gone through. Most 95% of their projects are done in one community. And then you move into the closeout process, which is the reconciliation of every project to the penny for FEMA and your state agencies' regulations. And those closeout processes are where FEMA will come in later, your state will come in later and do audits on some of the projects. So as think about that time frame as an example. This is a major project, and it was over $600 million in projects, but that project is still open and still being worked on by FEMA. So that gives you an indication of how big these items become. The other example I have is a local sheriff's office where it was a flood event. And we spent about 2 years with them and going through the same thing. And we were able to help them begin the process of regular reimbursements. And we moved into an uncharted territory where we helped them build a trailer park for their police department because they had no homes left for the police to live in. And it took 3 years for that to be reimbursed by FEMA. But ultimately it was. So these are the type items that you deal with. And very important right now is, Aaron mentioned it to you, because of the CARES Act money and all of the different funding opportunities that are coming down from governments, it's very important to keep track of what is eligible under your FEMA reimbursement process, because you can't duplicate that benefit. And most of you have probably dealt with this before. If you pay for something and you get reimbursed by the FEMA reimbursement, none of the other money becomes eligible. The only caveat is your portion, your 25% of the reimbursement. You may be able to get that reimbursed through some of the CARES Act money that Aaron was talking about. So that's a quick example of some of the things that could go your way and help you. The role of a outside grants manager coming in for you is really to help you with your staff augmentation, because you have other things that are going on besides the local disaster. And then this next slide is talking about, now's the time to activate your FEMA process. I'm sure most of you have already logged into your state or FEMA portal to become an applicant. Very important. That begins the process of you eligible for reimbursement. The good thing about that is, once you're eligible, you can then start gathering your information, your receipts, your invoices, your contracts, whatever you may have, put it together, and you can put in that reimbursement process through FEMA. Through this unprecedented event, I've been in government and around government most of my career. So, give or take 40 to 45 years, depending on what age I am today. So this is unprecedented. We have yet to have a disaster until COVID-19 that affects the entire United States. So given that, the federal government department of FEMA has been spread really thin. They're working other disasters. As I mentioned, we're still working with FEMA for Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2005. They have all these other disasters they're working. Then this disaster comes up, and you have every state in the union, every applicant, every city, every municipality, every county, every school board, every private nonprofit, every tribal agency. There's just so many applicants out there. So FEMA is going to run thin. So the quicker and the more you're able to get your ducks in a row, so to speak, and put the information together in their format, the better off you're going to be getting reimbursed. The other thing you're able to do is, if you have some odd items that are not typically reimbursed by FEMA, you can talk to FEMA about potentially what's your chances of getting that reimbursed. Currently, the disaster recovery period is through the end of December. But as everybody in the municipal world and in the government world, these are uncertain times and decisions being made as to when things are going to open up, when you're going to be able to get your economy back, when you're going to get your tax base back. And I went and researched this to make sure I was right, but the last bullet on this page tells you what we're in store for. There's already been more than 10 additional FEMA disaster declarations in this country after the COVID-19 declaration, which was March 13th. So given that these times, we understand how it's so important for you to look in different ways to get funded, to coordinate all these funding opportunities. And hopefully when what we've done for you today will give you some ideas, will make you think outside of the box a little bit, because in these times, this is certainly a time that we have to be thinking forward how we'll be able to do this. So thank you for your time. I know we have some questions that'll be answered later, and I'm going to turn it back over to Audrey. Thanks everybody for being here.
All right, and the next part of our presentation, we are actually going to review financial recovery for local governments, and Tom Fagan is going to lead. So hello, Tom, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hi, Audrey. Thanks again. So we want to get everybody into the mindset in this time, in this unprecedented time, when governments and municipalities are really starving for revenue. As Steve said, tax base is going down, in some cases 25 to 35%, maybe even more in other areas. So there's a lot of things that you can think about in regards to your taxing sources, to make sure that you're getting every penny from your existing tax sources, whether they be electric and gas, cable franchise fees, and within cable franchise fees or electric and gas, address boundaries, gross operating revenue, making sure that you're getting every penny that you deserve in this time when, especially like sales tax has been affected, in the last 90 to 120 days. Another area to look at, are you overpaying on your utility bills? You as a municipality are a customer as well. And that's another area in which you can identify gaps or places where you can streamline your energy and telecom costs. Are there enough exemptions on the bill? Are they providing for everything that a municipality should be getting within their customer stream? And then a little bit lower on the slide, adopting software. In this time of COVID, when your constituents are afraid to go out or can't go out or unable to go out, do you have a digitized platform by which that you can collect those revenues, whether they be dog walking license, business license, your food and beverage tax if it applies, your hotel motel taxes. It's a really up and coming part of governments to digitize and basically get the money to the bottom line, take the paperwork out of the equation, and ultimately get money to your bottom line faster so that you can do what you need to do for your constituents. Tax and fee collection, it's contactless. It's something that somebody can do in the privacy of their own home without having to make that trip out, thinking about possibly getting COVID-19. You also have software to possibly evaluate your tax revenue in this time, where 25 to 35% of your tax base is possibly gone within sales tax. How are you identifying those gaps and being able to move forward in this time so that you have a good handle, where it's not just hoping. Hope is not a plan for success. You want to have your eyes wide open to what you should expect, what you've had in the past, and see what your picture is going forward. That knowledge to allocate your resources in areas that you're weak. And so that is another great opportunity to identify revenues that could be due to you. Can you bring the slide down a little bit, Audrey? Thanks. Up, I meant, sorry.
What do you mean?
Up, can you actually bring it
Go
down?
back.
I can't see the top of the slide.
Oh, you
No,
can't.
the next slide. There we go. I can't. Sorry about that. You're looking for new streams of revenue. There's a lot of new ordinances that are out there. Different communities and different governments are looking at different streams of revenue. One that is all over the country, not only Illinois, is short-term rental platforms. There's more than you think. There's 24 platforms that help a person that wants to rent their room be able to do that. It's not just Verbo or HomeAway or Airbnb. There's many platforms that can be used to rent a room. And so, does your ordinance for hotel motel cover that? If you don't have a hotel motel within your municipality, is that an area that you can look at to identify that stream of revenue and make it prurient to your bottom line? Cable franchise fees changing all the time. The taxing sources of that, the cable franchise fees, gross operating revenue. Within cable franchises, are you identifying every address within your subset to make sure that you're getting every dollar and cent that is due to you as well? And then, scheduling a consultation. I am more than willing for my Illinois clients or our prospective Illinois clients to discuss our financial recovery program. I thank Steve and Aaron for getting on. They have a wealth of knowledge in FEMA and the CARES Act, and having them with us is a great benefit to what we do and how we do it. So I'd like to thank you again for having me. And Audrey, I'm going to turn it back to you, and we'll answer your questions.
All right, thank you so much, Tom.
Thank
and now
you.
we have Tom, Steve, and Aaron here to answer some questions. And I'm just going to start at the top. Please note that if we don't get to your answer to your question live, we do a elaboration at the end where we actually go through and we acknowledge and research all of the unanswered questions, and we'll send you a link to that. So we're going to start with Tricia. Tricia is asking, are park districts eligible for any of the local government disaster relief and recovery funds? If so, which ones? I think this would be a question for Aaron.
Yeah, so theoretically, where they are a division of a local government, they are eligible, on the surface. But the key thing to remember here is that they have to actually meet one of those specific criteria needs for the response. So I would say that's a very narrow window, because it has to be, as far as eligible expenses, it has to be something related to medical, public health, payroll expenses, or expensive actions related to responding to the virus. So yes, but it's a very narrow window to figure that out exactly. Is probably the best answer on that. So, and for all of these different, situations that's going on, one other thing that I kind of wanted to say a little more in this, not to try to get ahead, but I know this is part of some of the other questions that I saw come in too. These funds that are going out to local governments and to state governments across the country, particularly for the state governments, there's going to be 50 ways that that's being implemented. Different governor and perhaps the state legislature, they're making decisions about how to allocate those funds out, and they're going to be making different decisions. So particularly for the coronavirus relief fund, it's not going to be one size fits all for everybody. I would very much encourage you to talk specifically to the agency that is executing those funds within your state. Start at the governor's office and see if that's going through a local government agency or perhaps maybe even public health. They're all making their own decisions on this, and so it's important to see specifically what your state is doing, because it can be very much different from what other states are doing, and can be much more limited.
Thank you, Aaron. And this next question is from Jill. And I believe that she asked this question during the FEMA portion of the presentation. And if you need more information, I can ask Jill to just type it in the chat box. But she's asking, does this include judiciary specific to district courts? And I believe this would be a question for Steve.
Yes, they would be included for FEMA reimbursements. Yes. And again, it all depends on what they're spending the money on and how they spent it and what becomes a eligible item or not.
All right, thank you, Steve. And our next question is from Deanna. She asks, with the FEMA grant, how long should we wait to turn in our FEMA grant expenses? If we submit our expenses now and there's a second wave of COVID in the fall and we have additional expenses, will we be able to apply for more grant money? And Steve, this is probably a question for you.
Yep, good question. Yes, the simple answer is yes, do it now, turn it in. And then if you have more expenses, you'll be able to later too. That's why the emergency period is being extended all the way to December. So you can get reimbursements along the way. You don't have to wait for one.
Say that last sentence one more time. You got cut off, Steve.
Okay, sorry about that. So that's why FEMA has set up the category B expense. So you do not have to do reimbursement requests. You'll do your first one, call it a version. FEMA, you will submit the next request, and that'll be added to your request. So you can submit now your expenses, then any new ones you have, you can submit later. That's correct.
Thank you, Steve. And our next question comes from Steve. What triggers FEMA eligibility? For a municipality, must there be a disaster declaration by the county or the state or both?
Good question, Steve. And this is Steve. The answer is the declaration would have to be by the state. And then you would deal with the state directly as a municipality because you are an eligible reimbursement applicant as a legal state agency.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is from Amy. She says, I submitted expenses for Microsoft Surface Pros and software to maintain social distancing for employees to work from home. FEMA said that it was not eligible. Can you give me more information on how to get reimbursement for these expenses?
I'm going to first and then hand it off to Aaron. But this is going to be, Amy, a very good question that's going to be brought up at every level of every applicant because all the ones we're talking to and that we represent are certainly going through the same thing you're going through. As of right now, FEMA is holding their opinion that it's not an eligible item, but there's going to be a lot of discussion about should it be eligible because the only reason you did it was because of the emergency situation, and that's what FEMA reimburses is your response to situations. And then I think Aaron can answer some other funds that may be available.
Yeah, so I mean, from the coronavirus relief perspective, theoretically, this would fall in under the expensive actions to help facilitate compliance with the public health order. And, beyond local governments, there's also funds within the CARES Act for other agencies, kind of quasi-government agencies, even like public schools, as far as universities and different things. So I say that to say, that's more what this is geared toward. But for your particular circumstances, Amy, and others that are with us today, I would encourage you to look at the criteria put out specifically by your state and the insight that they've given, because the things that I went through today, those are the big picture federal government rules that all states and local governments must follow by. But then on a lower level, there's a local level of implementation that happens from state government. So would encourage you specifically to talk with your state government about that, just to make sure that it would be eligible and that they're accepting those funds.
Thank you, Aaron and Steve. Christina is asking, good morning. I heard that items such as masks and hand sanitizers for office staff are not eligible unless they are public safety. Is this correct?
Good question, Christina. We have submitted on this reimbursement for different agencies. We've yet to be reimbursed for them, but this is items that you are providing your staff for public safety. That's exactly why you're buying them, because they meet with the public. This will be our argument when we're discussing this with FEMA. You meet with the public, you're facing the public, and the reason you have the mask and the hand sanitizers and the plastic you may have put up to keep some distance between people is because of the COVID-19 emergency. So you are protecting the public, and that is public safety. So I would fight it hard to make sure you get reimbursed.
Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome.
And I would give the same answer to, just like I did in the previous question, specifically for these material needs related to the coronavirus relief fund. Look at what your state's saying specifically, and work to procure funds from there if that's an option, according to what guidance they're giving you.
Thank you, Aaron and Steve. I apologize if I am going to say anybody's name wrong in advance. This next question comes from Larvia, she asks, which funding would we apply for first, CARES or FEMA? I think this is a toss-up between Steve and Aaron, whoever wants to answer.
I don't care to answer. I would say yes to both of them. I mean, they have a window for what you can actually apply for under. The Public Assistance Fund under FEMA has very specific criteria, but some of the dollars can be utilized there that you could apply for. You couldn't apply for through the EDA or CDBG grant program or the Coronavirus Relief Fund. So look at the specific needs that you have in your community, how you've responded thus far, and how you're going to respond in the future, and make sure that you're looking across the board at these different pots of money, going after it in the appropriate areas. So all hands on deck, looking in all directions is what I would say.
Agreed. Very well said.
All right, thank you. Our next question states, is the Coronavirus Relief Fund access process similar across the nation? I'm in Georgia, in Metro Atlanta, and a part of an entitlement community. I think this would be for Aaron.
Yeah, so it's similar, as far as the U.S. Department of Treasury has given to the 50 states, and then the local governments over 500,000, and then funds have been distributed out, and they all are falling under this criteria that we mentioned. But the key point that I make is from here, it's up to those state governments, and then those local governments, if they have over 500,000 people, exactly those funds are going to be, or how they're going to get put on the ground. So in Georgia, would encourage you to look with the local government agency there or with the governor's office to see how they're actually executing those funds out, because every state's doing a little bit different because they're having to respond to the circumstances in different manners. So, work specifically and talk with your folks there, with your League of Cities perhaps. They might have some more information, but definitely the state executive branch should have more information on that.
Thank you, Aaron. Our next question comes from Tammy. She asks, on FEMA, if you have a salaried employee who is now doing their regular job, but also now spending part of their day doing FEMA reimbursement, policies, etc., and you want to pay them an additional pay for this, would that be covered by FEMA if it was over $3,500?
This is Steve. Very good question, Tammy. It's a little complicated the way that you're presenting it. The additional pay, it may or may not be covered. I'm not giving you an answer because policy that you had in when the COVID-19 depends on your personnel policy. If your personnel policy allows for you to do this at that time, then you probably would be reimbursed for that. On the other hand, the work that the person is doing on FEMA reimbursement and policies is an eligible item for reimbursement at whatever their current salary may be. That is called direct administrative cost, and you can be reimbursed for that. And yes, it has to be over $3,300 for your whole community, not just for one person. Reimbursement, if you have 33 hours of eligible expenses, the reimbursement process. Hope that answered you.
Thank you, Steve. And we have about 6 more minutes here. Our next question comes from Anonymous. They ask, are local emergency orders necessary to stay in place to get reimbursements?
Again, Veritas Steve again, good question. Currently, if you're trying for items that are emergency related, as in salaried overtime, things like that, then it's best to keep your emergency order in place. You could specifically ask that question to your state agency. They'd be able to answer that for you. But given that this emergency declaration goes through the end of this year by the federal government, I would imagine that whatever state you're in, you should be able to find out how they're going to reimburse you for the future.
Thank you, Steve. Our next question comes from Anonymous. With the CRF Fund, can we provide a relief program to those who cannot pay rent, utilities, and property taxes? I think this might be a question for Aaron.
Yeah, so one of the eligible expenses that we mentioned are expenses associated with the provision of economic support in connection with the COVID-19 public health emergency. So that's pretty broad, but it does give flexibility for governments to determine, specifically how to provide that economic support. So as I've kind of went through on the previous, I would encourage you to talk specifically with your state government to see what limitations they have put on the program and kind of make it deter for what could work.
Thank you, Aaron. Our next question comes from Joe. He asks, we are an Illinois public library district, separate taxing body in Kane County. Are we similar to a municipality in FEMA eligibility perception?
Steve answering Joe, good question. Yes, full answer. You should be, and find out simply by going to the emergency management division and applying. You can do it all online. Apply their website, and they will give you your determination of eligibility. That helps.
Thank you, Steve. And our next question comes from Barbara. She asks, would the gas and motor fuel tax gap for county highway departments be a possible reimbursement?
From FEMA, no, but Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, and from the others, no, it would not be. I mean, there's, local governments are really facing a gap right now to be, as you all know, to be able to meet the needs of their budget. But unfortunately, these funds cannot be utilized for that. They can only be in response to, costs to respond to the virus. They can't be to be able to help fill a hole. And that, that applies really across the board. So the answer is no on that.
Thank you, Aaron. Our next question comes from Lena. She asks, is there a timeline that FEMA is working on? Are they going to declare another declaration? And at what point is providing PPEs going to be something that is added to a budget? I think
Yep, it's Steve. Good question, Lena. FEMA, the timeline that they have on right now is December 30th, 2020 for the emergency declaration. Who knows what they're going to do? It depends on, I guess, how we come out of the initial wave of the coronavirus and what the future lies. And the other part of that is, let's see, I was looking at it and now I missed it. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I can go right back to it.
Okay.
At what point is providing PPEs going?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
FEMA reimbursement is that you're responding with PPEs because of the COVID-19 emergency. So as long as that emergency declaration is open, I would say that becomes a reimbursable item. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And that is all the time we have for today for questions, but my team and I are going to get together and go through all of the unanswered questions, and we will answer them and send you a link in our follow-up email. Again, you'll also be receiving a PDF of the slide deck, and in a couple days, I will send you a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel also. And right here, you can see we have 2 links. If you're interested in our financial recovery program for local governments, this is the second link down here. You can just book a short consultation with our experts. This recovery program actually includes the FEMA disaster grant writing, and Steve is the lead in that. And so if you're just interested in consultation on FEMA disaster grant funding, then I would suggest the first link. But if you're just interested in everything that we went over today, then definitely localgov.org/financial recovery program. And thank you again, IGFOA, for this opportunity. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.